Okay, so, you know, it seems like something pretty big is happening in the U.S. federal government. Like, you can feel it, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And that's actually exactly where we're going to dive in today with the federal workforce reductions that are happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
And, this all comes from a recent executive order, which, if you don't know, is a direct order from the president to the federal agencies.
Right.
And we get it. For you, getting right to the point and getting the most important information is what matters.
Exactly.
So we've really gone through all the news, all the reports, and we're bringing you the core information, cutting out the noise, the speculation, and just focusing on the facts here.
Yeah, the real stuff.
So in this deep dive, our mission is pretty clear. We want to understand just how big these federal workforce changes are, what the reasons behind them are, and what kind of impact they might have.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a really complex situation. So to really understand how important it is, we need to look at not just what's happening, but like the whole timeline of events and the motivations behind them. Okay.
Yeah.
And all the sources we've looked at, they paint a picture of a very intentional and a really fast change happening.
Okay, so let's break it down. Where does this all start? What was the initial, trigger?
Well, we have to remember President Trump's view on the federal government. He's always been a big advocate for a smaller federal government and giving more power to states.
Right, right.
I mean, he's been saying this for years, even before this executive order, so this wasn't some sudden change.
Yeah, that provides some good context.
Yeah.
So, according to all our sources, it seems like the moment that really kicked things off was February 11, 2025.
Yep, you got it. That's when President Trump issued the executive order, and it instructed federal agencies to get ready for what he called large-scale reductions in force, basically meaning lots of job cuts.
Right.
And based on the order itself, the initial focus was on things like offices that were suspended or, closed down, roles they thought were non-essential during a government shutdown, and temporary employees. It's also important to mention that jobs related to public safety, immigration enforcement, and law enforcement, those were actually excluded from the initial directive.
So it was a targeted approach at first, but then it seemed like things expanded pretty quickly. And then there was also that buyout offer. What was the thinking behind that?
Well, that was a pretty big strategic move. So just the next day, February 12th, they announced a deadline for federal employees to accept a buyout package.
Okay.
And this offer was pretty generous. I mean, we're talking about 8 months of pay and benefits.
Wow.
And from what the sources say, a lot of employees took it, somewhere around 75,000.
Really?
Yeah, so you could think of that as the first big wave of people leaving. It was a way to reduce the number of employees quickly.
Yeah, 75,000, that's a huge number right off the bat. Okay, so we have the executive order and this big buyout program happening, and then we start seeing specific actions from the different agencies.
Exactly.
Because let's go through that timeline, because things unfolded so quickly in February and March of 2025.
Yeah, it all happened really fast. So even before we got the formal guidance from the Office of Management and Budget, that's the OMB, the agency that helps the president manage the federal budget, and the Office of Personnel Management, which is the OPM that manages the federal workforce. We already saw some big announcements in early February.
Oh, okay.
Like the Department of Veterans Affairs or the VA, for example. They said they plan to lay off something like 76,000 employees. And their goal, well, they said it was to get back to the staffing levels they had during the first Trump administration back in 2019. We're talking about a massive restructuring of a very important government department.
Yeah, that's a huge change. And the Pentagon also took action, right? In early February, they fired something like 5,400 probationary employees.
That's right. These early moves really show that the administration was serious about putting the executive order into action quickly.
Okay.
Then on February 26th, the OMB and the OPM, they issued more detailed instructions. They sent a directive to all the heads of federal agencies and gave them a deadline of March 13th. And by this deadline, they had to submit their agency reorganization plans. So basically, each agency had to explain how they were going to cut down their workforce.
Got it. So March 13th becomes a really important date in all of this.
Yeah.
But even before that deadline, in early March, more agencies started making their moves public.
Exactly. So the Department of Veterans Affairs, they had already said what they were going to do and reportedly started putting those layoffs into effect in early March.
Okay.
And then we heard from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA.
Right.
And they announced over 1,000 layoffs. And to give you an idea of how big that is, that's about 20% of their total workforce.
Wow.
And the IRS, they were also in the process of firing about 12,000 employees. And the sources specifically said that these were mostly people who were hired during the Biden administration.
Oh.
And on top of that, the CIA also fired a bunch of probationary employees around this time, although they didn't say exactly how many.
So it was like a domino effect with all these agencies making announcements.
Yeah.
And then we get to March 11th, a Tuesday, when the Department of Education, led by Secretary Linda McMahon, revealed their plan. And that one was particularly big.
Yeah, that was a huge announcement. Secretary McMahon laid out a plan that would affect almost 50% of the Department of Education staff.
Really?
Yeah, that means something like 1,300 people would lose their jobs.
Wow.
And her reasons.
Yeah.
Well, according to reports, she said they needed to be more efficient, more accountable, and that resources should go directly to students, parents, and teachers.
Right. Right.
She basically said that this was a necessary step to restore the greatness of the United States education system.
Okay, so a really strong statement about their reasoning there.
Yeah.
Then we get to that important date, March 13th, a Wednesday. This seems like a really busy day for announcements.
It was. That's when EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin announced some big changes at the EPA.
Yeah.
He said they were going to close down the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, the Office of Inclusive Excellence, and the Environmental Justice Division in the regional EPA offices.
Okay.
And these closures were directly tied to the Trump administration's order to streamline their operations, to make them more efficient.
I see. And we also heard from NASA on that same Wednesday.
That's right.
Yeah.
NASA said they were going to gradually reduce their workforce, and that included closing 3 offices: the Office of Technology, Policy and Strategy, the Office of the Chief Scientist, and their Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Office. So you can see across all these scientific and regulatory agencies, it wasn't just about cutting jobs, it was also about shifting priorities and how they were organized.
Right, that makes sense. And then on the very same day, President Trump actually made some public comments on all these layoffs. What were the key things he talked about?
Well, he basically said that the labor market was going to be fantastic because there would be a shift to more manufacturing jobs that pay well.
Okay.
He was suggesting that we need to move away from so much government employment. He also repeated his view that the federal government has been way too big for the past 40 years.
Okay, yeah.
And interestingly, he also talked about education, saying that it should be mainly controlled by each individual state, which is something he's always believed.
So he was really laying out his whole philosophy behind these cuts. And then the next day, March 13th, a Thursday, that was the deadline for all the agencies to submit their layoff plans to the White House and the OPM.
Right.
And that's when we started to get some really specific and possibly pretty impactful details about the IRS.
Yeah, so what's really interesting here is the role of the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE.
Okay.
They're apparently being led by Elon Musk, and it seems like they're pushing for even more cuts, especially within the IRS. So there were details about their proposal to cut the IRS workforce by almost 20% by May 15th. This was in an internal email, and they were planning high-level meetings to discuss it.
Wow.
And that 20% reduction,
Yeah.
well, that's like another 6,800 jobs gone on top of the probationary firings and buyouts that already happened.
Right.
I mean, that's a really big chunk of their employees.
Yeah, it's a big cut, especially for an agency as important as the IRS,
Yeah.
since they handle all the federal revenue.
Exactly.
And then on that same Thursday, March 13th, there was also a big legal development.
You're right. There was a court ruling that said the Trump administration had to reinstate probationary workers who had been fired from 6 federal agencies.
Okay.
And this included the Treasury Department, which is the agency that oversees the IRS.
So how does that affect the IRS layoffs?
Well, we don't know yet what the immediate or long-term impact of this ruling will be on those plans, but it definitely makes things more complicated.
Yeah, it throws a wrench in the works, for sure. And we also started hearing from people inside the IRS about the DOGE proposal. And they had some pretty serious concerns about the consequences of all this.
Yeah, these insights from people inside the agency are really valuable. So we had one source who seemed to know about the DOGE proposal, and then a current IRS employee. And both of them were worried about the potential negative effects of these cuts.
What were they worried about specifically?
Well, they were worried about how it would impact the agency's ability to collect revenue effectively.
Right.
You know, the IRS collects most of the money that funds the government, so if they can't do their job well, it affects everything.
Yeah, that's a big problem.
They were also concerned about the quality of customer service that taxpayers would receive.
Okay.
If there aren't enough IRS employees to answer questions and help people, taxpayers are going to have to wait longer, and it's going to be a lot harder for them to get things done.
Makes sense.
And then there's the issue of voluntary tax compliance. Well, our tax system works because most people file and pay their taxes honestly.
Right.
But if people start thinking that the IRS doesn't have enough resources to audit them or enforce the tax laws, some people might not be as honest, and that could really hurt federal revenue.
So those are some pretty big concerns with potentially big implications. And it seems like they're aiming for May 15th to implement that nearly 20% reduction at the IRS under the DOGE plan. That's a really fast turnaround for such an important agency.
It is.
Okay, so let's talk about the why behind all of this.
Okay.
What are the main reasons that the administration has given for making all these cuts?
Well, the Trump administration has been pretty upfront about their reasons, and they haven't changed their message.
Okay.
They keep saying that the federal government costs too much, that it's not efficient, it has too much debt, and it's not really delivering results for the American people.
Right.
They also say that taxpayer money is going to what they call radical interest groups, which they don't like. And they see the results of the 2024 election as a clear sign that people want them to reform the government and make it smaller.
So they feel like they have a mandate from the voters to make these changes.
Exactly.
And Secretary McMahon also gave her specific reasons for the big cuts at the Department of Education, right?
Yes. She said the department was committed to making the education system more efficient and accountable.
Mm-hmm.
And she wanted to make sure resources were going directly to students, parents, and teachers. And, like she said, restoring the greatness of American education.
So she has a clear vision for how she wants to change things. And President Trump's economic views also play a big role here, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. He talks about a shift in the job market to higher-paying manufacturing jobs, suggesting that we've become too reliant on government jobs.
Right.
And he's always said that the federal government's been too big for decades, and he thinks these cuts are necessary to fix that.
So it sounds like it's a mix of beliefs about the role of government, economic priorities, and how they interpret their political mandate that are driving these actions. Let's take a moment to mention some of the key players in this whole story.
Okay, so we have President Donald Trump, who started this big shift with his executive order.
Right.
Then we have Secretary Linda McMahon at the Department of Education and EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin. They're both important in making these big cuts in their agencies.
Right, okay.
And then there's DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, reportedly led by Elon Musk. They seem to be pushing for even deeper cuts, especially at the IRS.
Yeah.
We also have the OMB and the OPM. They provide the guidelines that the agencies have to follow.
Okay.
And we can't forget those people who are speaking out anonymously, sharing their insights and concerns from inside the government. They give us a really important perspective.
Absolutely. Those voices from inside are really crucial to understanding what's really going on. Now let's talk about the potential consequences of all these job cuts, especially at the IRS, since it plays such a big role in government funding. What are some of the main concerns people are raising?
Well, the biggest concern is probably the impact on how the government collects revenue.
Right.
We've talked about how the IRS collects most of the money that funds the entire government. So if they cut their workforce so much, it could have a big negative impact on how much money the government takes in.
Right, right.
There are also worries about what will happen to customer service for taxpayers. If there aren't enough IRS employees to help people and answer their questions, taxpayers are going to have to wait longer and have a harder time getting things done.
Yeah, for sure.
And then there's this concern about what's called voluntary tax compliance.
Okay, remind me what that is again.
It means that our tax system basically works because most people file and pay their taxes honestly. But if people think that the IRS doesn't have the resources to audit them, they might not be as honest, and that would really hurt the government's revenue.
Yeah, it's kind of a snowball effect.
Exactly.
And on top of the impact on how the IRS works, we're also hearing about how this is affecting the people who work there and their morale.
Oh, yeah. The reports we're getting from inside the IRS are, well, it doesn't sound good. People are really stressed, and the work environment is tough.
Oh, no.
One of the IRS employees we talked about earlier said that people are crying, managers are having to apologize for all the firings and the chaos, and Social media is blowing up.
Oh, wow.
It just shows how much these changes are disrupting the agency and affecting people's lives. People are worried about their jobs, they have more work to do, and it's just a really tough situation.
And it sounds like there's some pushback happening with people challenging these changes legally.
Yeah, there's a lawsuit filed by Democratic attorneys general challenging the layoffs at the Department of Education. We don't know all the details about that lawsuit, but it's definitely a sign of resistance. And then there's that court ruling we mentioned earlier that said some probationary federal workers, including those at the Treasury Department, which oversees the IRS, have to be reinstated.
Right. Right.
We don't know yet how much these legal challenges will affect the bigger picture of workforce reductions, but they're definitely a point of contention.
So just to sum up where we are, there's a massive reduction happening in the federal workforce, and it's being driven by the Trump administration's goal of making the government more efficient and smaller overall.
Yeah.
And this is happening across many agencies, with especially big cuts planned for the IRS.
Exactly. And it's clear that President Trump's vision of a smaller federal government with more power to the states and a focus on manufacturing is the driving force behind all this.
But as we've discussed, there are a lot of serious concerns about what this might mean for the government's ability to serve the public, for how the government collects revenue, and for the people who work for the federal government.
Exactly. This leads to a really important question for you to think about. You know, with all these changes happening so fast and on such a big scale, what do you think the long-term effects will be on how well the federal government functions and how effectively it can provide services to the American people? Are there any consequences we're not seeing yet from this rapid restructuring of the federal government? This is definitely a situation that's still unfolding, and understanding these initial moves is just the beginning of understanding the bigger changes happening right now.
Yeah, definitely a lot to think about.